What's up, guys? This is Chris from DraftDashboard.com. Here are my DFS picks for NBA Monday, January 30th. These picks apply for DraftKings and FanDuel. Before I get started, please drop a like on this video and hit that red subscribe button and hit that bell icon so you don't miss our new videos. In this video, I'm going to go over my top picks for today's NBA slate. And if you stick around to the very end of this video, we'll use the Draft Dashboard tools to make a DFS lineup using the picks we just made. Okay guys, let's take a look at this 8-game NBA slate tonight. At the point guard position, I like De'Aaron Fox from the Sacramento Kings playing the Minnesota Timberwolves, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall. They give up the fifth most fantasy points to opposing point guards. De'Aaron Fox has averaged 40.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 29% usage rate. He's projected at 39.6 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. I think he can score 42 fantasy points or more in this one, get you 5 times value or more. He's 8,300 DraftKings salary, 200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 236.5 points scored in this game, and De'Aaron Fox has scored 46, 32, and 45 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 34, 30, and 32 minutes. And De'Aaron Fox has scored 46, 47, 48, 36, and 52 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Timberwolves. So I like De'Aaron Fox here versus the Minnesota Timberwolves. Okay, now we picked this player last time he played and he put up a monster stat line, and I like him again here tonight. Take a look at Chris Paul from the Phoenix Suns playing the Toronto Raptors, who have a good defense overall, middle of the pack defending opposing point guards. Chris Paul has averaged 36.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He's projected at 35.8 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 40 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's 8,200 DraftKings salary, 100 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 226.5 points scored in this game. And Chris Paul has scored 64, 49, and 39 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 39, 38, and 27 minutes. I also like this pick because Chris Paul has scored 46, 47, and 42 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the Toronto Raptors. Hasn't scored under 39 fantasy points in his last 4 games. Outside of that 39, 49 was his lowest, then a 55 and a 64. So he's on fire. So I like Chris Paul here versus the Toronto Raptors. Okay, another point guard that I like, he's been playing really well lately. Salary's only up a couple thousand. So I like D'Angelo Russell from the Minnesota Timberwolves playing the Sacramento Kings, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, middle-of-the-pack defending opposing point guards. D'Angelo Russell has averaged 34 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. He's projected at 33.4 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.8 times value. He's 7,000 DraftKings salary, 200 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 236.5 points scored in this game. And D'Angelo Russell has scored 41, 44, and 36 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 37, 37, and 38 minutes. I also like this pick because D'Angelo Russell has scored 41, 56, 28, 38, and 38 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Kings. Hasn't scored under 36 in his last 5 games, so he's been hot. So I like D'Angelo Russell here versus the Sacramento Kings. Okay, let's take a look at the shooting guard position. I like Bradley Beal from the Washington Wizards playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 12th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Bradley Beal has averaged 36.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 33 minutes per game with a 28% usage rate. He's projected at 36.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5 times value. He's $7,200 DraftKings salary, $800 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 235 points scored in this game. Bradley Beal has scored 29, 26, and 30 fantasy points in his last 3 games, playing 32, 29, and 30 minutes. So he's been underperforming his season average in fantasy points and in minutes per game for the last 3 games. But he's got a good matchup here tonight, and Bradley Beal has scored 32, 50, 45, and 44 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Spurs. So I like Bradley Beal here versus the San Antonio Spurs.
Before I continue with the picks, I'm excited today because we added a new contest for everyone watching.
If you want to enter the drawing for $25 PayPal,
all you need to do is like this video, hit that subscribe button, and make a quick comment below to be entered into the drawing. We'll reply to a random comment and let you know that you won.
And then we'll send you $25 PayPal.
So it's that easy, and we pick a new winner every Saturday and announce them in our video. So get your comment in now so I can add another entry for you.
Another shooting guard that's been playing well recently with a good matchup is Klay Thompson from the Golden State Warriors playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have the 8th worst defense overall, give up the 5th most fantasy points to opposing shooting guards. Klay Thompson has averaged 32.8 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 27% usage rate. Now, he's projected at 30.5 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 35 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's $6,700 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel, and Vegas thinks there's going to be 241.5 points scored in this game. So it's a high-scoring game. I think this will be a good game to stack. And Klay Thompson has scored 45, 36, and 14 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 37, 34, and 33 minutes. So I like Klay Thompson here versus the Oklahoma City Thunder. Oh, and Klay scored 34 fantasy points in his last game versus the Thunder. Okay, now here's a value play. Take a look at Cole Anthony from the Orlando Magic playing the Philadelphia 76ers, who have a good defense overall, been good versus opposing shooting guards. But Cole Anthony has averaged 26.3 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 21% usage rate. He's projected at 25.1 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he could score 30 fantasy points or more in this one. He's $5,000 DraftKings salary, $700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game, and Cole Anthony has scored 39, 30, and 20 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 30, 27, and 24 minutes. And Cole Anthony has scored 34, 28, and 46 fantasy points in his last 3 games versus the 76ers. So I like Cole Anthony here versus the Philadelphia 76ers. Okay, let's take a look at the small forward position. I like Tobias Harris from the Philadelphia 76ers, playing the Orlando Magic, who have the 9th worst defense overall, give up the 4th most fantasy points to opposing small forwards. Tobias Harris has averaged 31.7 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 34 minutes per game with a 20% usage rate. He's projected at 30.1 fantasy points here tonight. That's 4.9 times value. He's 6,100 DraftKings salary, 700 more on FanDuel. Vegas thinks there's going to be 232.5 points scored in this game, and Tobias Harris has scored 27, 27, and 31 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32, 32, and 25 minutes. But I like this pick because take a look at Tobias Harris versus the Orlando Magic. He scored 45, 46, 44, 39, and 47 fantasy points in his last 5 games versus the Magic. So I like Tobias Harris here versus the Orlando Magic. Okay, let's take a look at the power forward position. I like Jeremiah Grant from the Portland Trailblazers, playing the Atlanta Hawks, who have the 6th worst defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Jeremiah Grant has averaged 34 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 36 minutes per game with a 23% usage rate. And Jeremiah Grant has he's projected at 33.7 fantasy points here tonight. That's 5.4 times value. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 400 more on FanDuel. Jeremiah Grant has scored 47, 34, and 11 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 40, 42, and 27 minutes. And I like this pick because he's got a pretty good track record here versus the Hawks. Jeremiah Grant has scored 40, 32, 27, and 48 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Hawks. So I like Jeremiah Grant here versus the Atlanta Hawks.
Real quick, guys, I got great news. For a limited time, we're offering a full 30-day trial to Draft Dashboard. You can try all of our DFS tools for all sports. You can try the Position Optimizer, where you can see the top players ranked for each position. And we added a new Player Trends tool, where you can see the top salary differences between FanDuel and DraftKings. It's a really good tool to help you pick out value for the site that you're playing on. Oh, and if you're tired of doing research every day, we just added a cheat sheet that shows hand-picked plays for the slate. No confusing stat lines, no headaches, just a simple cheat sheet that shows the absolute best players for your lineups.
Okay, now here's a value play. I like Denny Avdija from the Washington Wizards, playing the San Antonio Spurs, who have the worst defense overall, give up the 2nd most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Denny Avdija has averaged 22.5 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He's projected at 21.4 fantasy points here tonight, but I think he can score 25 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. Only 4,700 DraftKings salary. He is 1,200 more on FanDuel, so I love that DraftKings price. Vegas thinks there's going to be 235 points scored in this game, and Denny Avdija has scored 32, 33, and 39 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 29, and 32 minutes. So I like Denny Avdija, who scored 32 fantasy points in his last game versus the Spurs, here versus the San Antonio Spurs. Okay, another power forward that I like is Draymond Green from the Golden State Warriors, playing the Oklahoma City Thunder, who have the 8th worst defense overall, give up the 7th most fantasy points to opposing power forwards. Draymond Green has averaged 29.9 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 32 minutes per game with a 12% usage rate. He's projected at 28.7 fantasy points here tonight. I think he can score 32 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's 6,300 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 241.5 points scored in this game. Draymond Green has scored 23, 40, and 35 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 32 minutes in each of those games. And I like this pick because Draymond Green has scored 43, 38, 47, and 30 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Thunder. So I like Draymond Green here versus the Oklahoma City Thunder. Okay, moving on to the center position. I like Clint Capella from the Atlanta Hawks playing the Portland Trailblazers, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 3rd most fantasy points to opposing centers. Clint Capella has averaged 32.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 27 minutes per game with a 16% usage rate. He's projected at 28.7 fantasy points here tonight. I think he can score 32 fantasy points or more, get you 5 times value or more. He's 6,000 DraftKings salary, 1,000 more on FanDuel. And Clint Capella has scored 39, 36, and 41 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 27, 27, and 36 minutes. And he has a good track record here versus the Trailblazers. Clint Capella has scored 34, 39, 34, and 54 fantasy points in his last 4 games versus the Trailblazers. So I like Clint Capella here versus the Portland Trailblazers. Now I also like Jacob Piotr from the San Antonio Spurs playing the Washington Wizards, who have a middle-of-the-pack defense overall, give up the 10th most fantasy points to opposing centers. Jacob Piotr has averaged 31.1 fantasy points per game on the season, playing an average of 26 minutes per game with an 18% usage rate. He's projected at 29.7 fantasy points here tonight, and that's 5.1 times value. Only 5,800 DraftKings salary, 800 more on FanDuel. We know Vegas thinks there's going to be 235 points scored in this game, and Jacob Piotr has scored 37, 17, and 23 fantasy points in the last 3 games, playing 33, 22, and 22 minutes. And Piotr has scored 59 and 37 fantasy points in his last 2 games versus the Wizards. So I like Jacob Piotr here versus the Washington Wizards.
If you want to try all these daily fantasy tools for yourself, click the link in the description below this video or just go to draftdashboard.com. You can use our DFS lineup optimizer to build quality lineups using our picks and your own custom player pool. Click the link in the description below this video and try all these daily fantasy tools right now. Thanks so much for watching. Oh, and don't forget to subscribe to this channel and hit that bell icon so you can get instant updates whenever we post a new video. Thank you so much for watching, everyone. If you enjoyed this video, please smickety smash that like button and subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. Oh, and please comment below with your favorite player for this NBA slate. I love to hear what you guys have to think. Thanks again, and good luck.